So we just had our final Dune Awakening developer livestream before the official launch of the game on June 10th or June 5th if you're buying any of the more expensive versions of the game. And this final developer livestream was focused around the mid-game of Haga Basin and the end game of the Deep Desert. And for this video, I primarily want to go over all of the information you're going to need for the Deep Desert, which is the primary end game of Dune Awakening on launch. Now to start off, we need to do an overview of the Deep Desert, but to do that, we have to do an overview of how Dune Awakening is going to work. So once you start Dune Awakening, you're going to create your character, then you're going to choose your world, which is essentially choosing a server or a realm from other MMOs. So if you're, say, on World 1, only the other people that choose World 1, you would be able to see or play with in, let's say, the Deep Desert. If someone goes on World 2, you will never play with them. So after you've loaded into the game, you'll do this like 10-minute tutorial section where then you'll enter the first map of the game, Haga Basin, and you'll start off in a kind of starter area of Haga Basin. As you progress more and more, you go to kind of the other areas and higher level areas of the Haga Basin. Now Haga Basin is going to be a map generally the size of their previous game, Conan Exiles, so it's going to be massive, but Haga Basin is primarily PvE focused. There are some small PvP areas, but it's like 95% PvE focused, and you'll only be able to have 40 people on one Haga Basin at a time, and there'll be a bunch of different versions of Haga Basin. So let's say there'll be 20 different versions of Haga Basins on one world. They will actually be on things called sieges, but that will be the first area you're playing in Dune Awakening. The developers have said there's like 100 hours of unique content here, and once you progress through Haga Basin enough, you'll be able to make your first flying vehicle, the Ornithopter. Once you get that, you'll be able to fly to the other maps of Dune Awakening. There's 2 player hubs, which are essentially just 2 different cities. That's non-combat areas. You'll still be able to see a bunch of players there. There will be the player market there. There'll be NPCs and quest givers. There'll be vendors, but those aren't combat areas. But the other main area you'll be able to fly to is the Deep Desert, and that's really where the endgame starts, and that's actually the primary landmass of Dune Awakening. Because while Haga Basin is like the size of Conan Exiles, the Deep Desert is generally like 9 times the size of Conan Exiles. This landmass is absurdly large, and there's going to be a lot of content there. Now, unlike Haga Basin, the Deep Desert is primarily PvP focused, but there is a strip that does not have PvP enabled, and it's fully PvE. And essentially how this works is once you first go into and you're in the PvE strip, which is still behind the shield wall, so you're kind of up on these cliffs. It's still a pretty massive area, this PvE section, but after you go past that and you go into the PvP section of the Deep Desert, you're essentially coming off of a cliff and you're going into the massive open desert. That's the rest of the Deep Desert. That's absurdly large, and this is where a majority of the end game content takes place. And I think a good place to start is how the Deep Desert is going to work on a technical level, because this is not only something that's very interesting, but it's also something that's still kind of confusing because of some recent information we've gotten from some developers. So we know the Deep Desert is split into 9 different zones, essentially, that are meshed zones, meaning they're hosted on different servers. Now, while they're hosted on different servers, you can freely travel between them. There isn't even any hitching going between these zones, as we saw in the most recent live stream. You will get a notification that you're going into the next zone, but it's free travel. They're just meshed and hosted on different servers, so you can have different player counts in each of them. A player count in one zone won't affect the player count in another zone. So you won't have like 100 people fighting in one area, and then the next zone over is lagging because of that. So they're just hosted on different servers, but there is no sharding or instancing or anything like that in the Deep Desert. In your overarching world, if there's a person in this part of the Deep Desert and you go to that part, you will always see that person. There's no instancing or anything like that. Everybody who, say, is playing on World 1 shares the same Deep Desert. So this is really where the big player count of an MMO comes into play in Dune Awakening. Now, some recent information we've gotten kind of throws a wrench into how the Deep Desert is actually going to work, because previously, up until this point, we were always told that the Deep Desert was split into 9 different zones, which it still is, and that each one of these different zones would have its own player cap, which still seems to be the case, but the way one of the developers recently explained it, we don't know if each one of these zones has their own player cap, and that's kind of of the main thing, or if the deep desert itself also has its own player cap to where if there's too many people in just the deep desert as a whole, then nobody else can go there. Because in an interview with Shroud, one of the developers made it sound like if 300 people are in the deep desert overall, that other people wouldn't be able to go into the deep desert. But when they were talking about it, there was also sections that sounded like it wasn't that they were just talking about one section, because the developer was talking about it that the deep desert is essentially split into 3x3. So it's 3 different like sections split into 3 times, which would still be 9 different zones. So it was just quite confusing on how the developer was talking about the deep desert there. So I guess until we get more clarification or until we play the game, the deep desert at minimum is going to have a 300 player cap and at maximum a 900 player cap, but we don't exactly know how this is going to work now, but that's generally how it's working. Now, looking past the player caps in the technical aspects, the deep desert is going to have a lot of content in it because it's so massive, and after you get past that PvE section of the deep desert, everything is open PvP. If you see another player, you can attack them. That also includes in your guild or in your same faction. So if you join one of the factions, you can still attack people of your same faction. You can still attack people in your own guild, because also players in your guild don't have like icons above their heads or anything like that. In fact, only people in your party, and you can be in parties of up to 4, only people in your party will have a small number above their head. Nobody else in the game will have a number above their head. Your guildies, enemies, nobody will have numbers above their head, and it's full friendly fire even with your guildmates. So keep that in mind. It is just full open PvP. Now, one thing a lot of people have been confused on is that Dune Awakening is not a full loot PvP game. If you say go to the deep desert and die by another player, you will lose some of your resources, maybe all of your resources. We're not sure on that yet, but you won't lose any of your gear or anything. Your gear will take some durability damage, so you have to repair it, but you don't lose all of your gear or anything. You don't drop any of your gear. So that's something to keep in mind. Even though it's fully open PvP, Dune Awakening is not full loot PvP. But the deep desert is going to consist of a lot of different pieces of content. There's going to be the massive spice blows, which is one of the really interesting things they showed off in this developer live stream. There's going to be points of interest, which are just camps you can go clear out of NPCs and loot all the chests and get all of the different loot from that. There's going to be your ecology labs, which are the dungeons of Dune Awakening, where you can go in, clear the enemies, loot all the chests, defeat the boss at the end, and get the unique schematics out of those ecology labs. There's going to be all of the different resources everywhere, and the deep desert is going to have essentially its own tier of resources, which is essentially going to be tier 6. So you won't be able to be getting like tier 6 stuff from Haga Basin. You'll have to go to the deep desert for that or buy it from other players on the exchange. There will also be other things that try to get players to come together to fight each other. Like there will be capture points that are part of the Lancerad that as you capture those points, you keep getting points over time towards the endgame Lancerad system. So you'll be fighting over those. And then there will be other points of interest and things are on the map. Like there will still be those ship crashes that come in that you can go and try to harvest resources from. So pretty much every type of content you come across in the Haga Basin will also exist in the deep desert. It will just have different rewards and different loot within those pieces of content. More specifically, that's where you'll be getting like tier 6 resources and tier 6 items. But there is no instancing in Dune Awakening. So if you go to like a lot of other MMOs, if you go into a dungeon, that's an instance dungeon only for you and your party. In Dune Awakening, the ecology labs, which are essentially Dune Awakening's dungeons, aren't instanced. Other players can come in there and fight you while you're doing these dungeons. So while this is going to be more endgame PvE content, other players can still enter those ecology labs with you and fight you while you're in there. But keep in mind, the deep desert is so absurdly massive that there actually isn't going to be like a super high chance that you're just running into people super consistently. It's actually a pretty low chance that you'll just be consistently running into players in the deep desert unless you're going to the things that are trying to draw players in, like the capture points or the massive spice blows. Even in dungeons, unless this dungeon is known that week to have a super good like blueprint or something like that, you probably won't be coming across people super often. But one of the most unique aspects of the Deep Desert is the weekly Coriolis Storm. So the Deep Desert essentially resets on a weekly basis. Every week the Coriolis Storm comes through, it'll wipe away pretty much the entirety of the map. So if you say build bases in the Deep Desert, it gets wiped away on a weekly basis. Pretty much all of the other content in the Deep Desert is changed up in some way on a weekly basis. We don't know if it's going to be 100% of content or if some will stay for a week and some will change, but a lot of the content is going to change up. So essentially the storm comes through, it could say fill in an ecology lab you played last week and open up a new one. Or it could fill in this point of interest and open up a new one somewhere. So essentially all the content is in some way changing with seemingly some amount of randomization, but this also means that players won't know where the good points of interest are, won't know where the good dungeons are, won't know where the really lucrative resource points are. So every week it's kind of like a new wipe, which I've compared to something like Rust weekly wipes. But another one of the really big differences with Dune Awakening as a whole is that in Haga Basin, the PvE focus zone, that's where your permanent bases will be, where you can't really raid each other's bases. So even though the Deep Desert is wiped on a weekly basis, you're still able to just take all of the resources you've been gaining from the Deep Desert and bring them back to your permanent base, and then go back after the wipe and go back to essentially a new version of the Deep Desert, make your bases there for that week, and go find out where all the new content is. But that's pretty much all of the information we have for the Deep Desert, which is going to be the primary endgame content of Dune Awakening on launch. And this is going to be a massive part of the game. So even if you're a PvE focused player, you can still go into the PvP areas of the Deep Desert and have a pretty low chance of actually getting into PvP. Not only are you going to be able to modify your vehicles to make them really fast, you can just run away from other players, but the actual landmass of the Deep Desert is just so absurdly massive that it's not going to be super common for you to just be coming across players all of the time. So if you're a PvE focused player, you don't want a PvP, you can do a lot to never have to go into that content while still being in the Deep Desert. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.